I never thought I'd find myself back in the town where everything stood still. The same cracked sidewalks, the same rusted fences along the main road, and the same distant hills casting shadows over the fields. It felt like stepping into a photograph, one that hadn't aged with me. Yet here I was, returning after 7 years of city life, pulled back by a family crisis and the quiet insistence of my cousin, Caleb. Caleb was the one person who made this place feel less suffocating. Growing up, he was more like an older brother than a cousin, always protective, always knowing how to draw me out of my shell. Even now, standing in the driveway of the old family house, his presence had a grounding effect. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed, his sun-roughened skin glowing in the afternoon light. When he saw me, his grin widened, the kind of smile that could disarm anyone. "Long time no see," he said, his voice as warm and familiar as I remembered. I smiled back, though it felt hesitant. "Yeah, too long, I guess." He stepped closer, wrapping me in a quick, firm hug. It wasn't unusual for Caleb to be so tactile. He always had been. But something about the way his hand lingered on my back sent a flicker of unease through me. I brushed it off as my overactive imagination. "We've got a lot of work to do," he said, pulling away. "But it'll be good, like old times." I nodded, following him toward the house. The weight of the years apart hung between us, unspoken but heavy. As we entered the house, the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. Memories stirred with every creak of the floorboards. Memories of summers spent here as kids, when life was simpler and we didn't carry the burdens we do now. "Still feels the same," I said quietly, running my hand along the banister of the staircase. "Not everything," Caleb replied, his tone lighter. "You've changed, in a good way." I glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. There was something in his expression, soft, unreadable, that made my chest tighten. I turned away, unsure of how to respond. Caleb's words lingered as we got to work, clearing out the clutter that had accumulated over years of neglect. The house creaked and groaned as if resenting our intrusion, but Caleb's easy laughter filled the space, chasing away the silence that had been there before. We worked side by side, our movements slowly falling into a rhythm. Caleb was stronger than I remembered, his body honed by years of physical labor on the farm. I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he lifted the heavy boxes, how the muscles in his forearms flexed with each motion. It was the kind of thing I never would have paid attention to before, but now it felt impossible to ignore. Every so often, our hands would brush as we passed tools or rearranged furniture, and each time it sent an inexplicable jolt through me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking. But Caleb seemed to notice, too. His gaze lingered a little longer each time, his smiles softer, more private. The sun had begun to set by the time we took our first real break. We sat on the back porch, the evening air cool and heavy with the scent of earth and grass. Caleb handed me a beer, and we sat in silence for a while, watching the horizon. The quiet between us felt different, charged, almost expectant. "You've changed too," I said finally, my voice breaking the stillness. Caleb glanced at me, his lips quirking into a faint smile. "Yeah? How so?" I shrugged, unsure how to put it into words. "You just seem, I don't know, calmer, like you've got it all figured out." He laughed at that, a deep, rich sound that made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. "Trust me, I'm making it up as I go. Same as always." His honesty disarmed me, as it always had. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The soft lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hair had grown a little longer than it used to be, curling slightly at the ends. He looked like home in a way I hadn't felt in years. "You've always been good at pretending you know what you're doing," I said, smiling despite myself, "and you've always been good at calling me out on it." He leaned back, resting his arms on the railing behind him. The movement brought him closer to me, and I felt the brush of his shoulder against mine. It was such a small thing, but it made my heart race. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. Caleb turned his head to look at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes. Something vulnerable, almost searching. The air between us felt heavier, the unspoken words pressing down on us like a weight. "I missed you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of cicadas. The words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened. "I missed you too." We didn't say anything else after that. We didn't need to. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken things I wasn't ready to name. As the last of the light faded, Caleb stood and offered me his hand. "Come on, let's get cleaned up." I hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was warm and steady, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The next few days passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Caleb and I fell into an easy rhythm, our conversations laced with the kind of familiarity that comes from years of shared history. But beneath the surface, there was something new, something neither of us could bring ourselves to acknowledge. It was in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his hand lingered on my arm when he passed me a tool, the way his voice softened when he said my name, and it was in the way my pulse quickened every time he got too close, the way my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't allow myself to have. One evening, after another long day of work, Caleb suggested we take a break and head down to the river. The idea of cooling off in the water was too tempting to resist, so I agreed. We walked in comfortable silence, the fading light casting long shadows across the fields. When we reached the river, Caleb pulled off his shirt without hesitation, revealing the broad, tanned expanse of his back. I turned away, pretending to focus on untying my shoes, but my hands trembled. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But when I looked up and saw him wading into the water, his movements effortless and confident, I couldn't deny the heat that rose in my chest. "You coming in or what?" he called over his shoulder, his grin playful. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension that had been building inside me all day. Yeah, I'm coming." The water was cool against my skin, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Caleb swam a little ahead of me, his laughter echoing off the trees as he splashed me. It felt like we were kids again, carefree and unburdened. But then he swam closer, his movement slowing, his laughter fading. When he stopped in front of me, the distance between us suddenly felt too small. For a moment, neither of us moved. The water lapped gently around us, the world quiet except for the sound of our breaths. Caleb's gaze locked onto mine, his expression unreadable. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He started, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He shook his head, looking down at the water. "Never mind." "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me again, and this time, there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. "It's nothing. Forget I said anything." But I couldn't forget. The weight of what he wasn't saying hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Caleb froze, his gaze dropping to where my fingers rested against his skin. When he looked back up, his eyes were filled with something raw and unguarded. "I don't think I can keep pretending," he said, his voice low and rough. "Pretending what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He took a step closer, the water rippling around us. "That I don't feel this." I felt the world narrow down to the space between us, the weight of his words crashing over me like a wave. My hand was still on his arm, and though every instinct told me to pull away, I couldn't bring myself to move. Caleb's eyes searched mine, and I could see the vulnerability there, the fear that he'd gone too far, but he hadn't. Not for me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice unsteady, the lie clumsy even to my own ears. "Yes, you do." Caleb's voice was quiet but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "You've felt it too, haven't you?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the cool water around us. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and pretend this moment wasn't happening. But I couldn't lie to him. Not about this. Not when the truth was written all over my face. "Yes," I admitted, the word barely audible. "I've felt it." Caleb exhaled sharply, his relief palpable. He took another step closer, and now there was barely an inch of space between us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body even in the cool water, the tension between us crackling like electricity. "I don't know what to do about it," I said, my voice trembling. This isn't supposed to happen." "Maybe not," Caleb said softly, "but it has." He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so tentative, as if he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, and all I could focus on was the way his hand felt against my skin. "Caleb," I whispered, his name barely more than a breath. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. The moment his lips touched mine, every doubt, every fear melted away, leaving only the undeniable truth of what we both felt. I kissed him back, my hands finding their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if he might disappear. The world around us faded, the water lapping gently against us the only sound. His lips were warm and firm, moving against mine with a tenderness that made my chest ache. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession, a culmination of everything we'd been trying to ignore. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting together. Caleb's hands were still on my face, his thumbs brushing softly against my skin. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't be," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not." He looked at me then, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite name. It was vulnerability, yes, but also something deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "We should go back," I said, breaking the silence. Caleb nodded, though neither of us moved right away. Eventually he stepped back, his hand trailing down my arm as he let go. The loss of his touch was almost painful, but I pushed the feeling aside, following him out of the water. The walk back to the house was quiet, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. By the time we reached the porch, the tension was almost unbearable. Caleb hesitated at the door, his hand on the handle as he turned to look at me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Yeah, I think so." He gave me a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. Get some rest. We've got a long day tomorrow." He disappeared inside before I could respond, leaving me alone on the porch. I sank onto the steps, my head in my hands as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my lips still tingling from the kiss. I couldn't believe it had happened, that I'd let it happen. But more than that, I couldn't believe how much I wanted it to happen again. The next day was a blur. We worked side by side, our conversations polite but stilted, the weight of what had happened the night before hanging over us like a cloud. Caleb seemed to be avoiding my gaze, and every time our hands brushed or our shoulders bumped, he pulled away as if burned. It wasn't until the sun was setting and we were sitting on the porch again that the silence finally broke. "We need to talk about last night," Caleb said, his voice low. I stiffened, my stomach twisting with nerves. "I know." He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "I don't regret it. I need you to know that." I met his gaze, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "I don't either." His shoulders relaxed slightly as if he'd been bracing himself for a different answer, but I don't know where we go from here." "Neither do I admitted, "but I know I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Caleb nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's better if nobody finds out," he said quietly. "For now, at least." I knew he was right. The world wouldn't understand. Our family wouldn't understand. But as I reached out and took his hand in mine, I realized that none of that mattered. Not in this moment. "All I know," I said, my voice steady, "is that I want to figure it out. With you." Caleb looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I could only describe as hope. He gave my hand a small squeeze, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Then we will," he said. "Together." The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. We kept up appearances, working side by side during the day, careful not to let anyone see the way our hands lingered a little too long when we passed tools, or the way our gazes lingered when we thought no one was looking. But at night, when the house was quiet and the rest of the world faded away, we allowed ourselves to be honest. It started with stolen moments, a hand brushing against mine as we passed in the hallway, a whispered "good night" that carried more weight than it should. And then, slowly, those moments grew. A kiss stolen in the darkness of the living room, a quiet conversation on the porch that stretched long into the night. Caleb was cautious, always pulling back before things went too far, but there was no denying the pull between us. It was like a fire that couldn't be extinguished, no matter how hard we tried. One night, as we sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, the tension between us finally came to a head. Caleb reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice raw. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Pretending like I don't want you," he said, his gaze intense. "Like this isn't the only thing I think about." I felt the air leave my lungs, my chest tightening under the weight of his words. Caleb's hand lingered over mine, his fingers trembling slightly, a rare crack in the unshakable confidence he so often wore like armor. The kitchen light above us flickered faintly, and the silence of the house seemed to stretch out, enclosing us in a fragile bubble. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, though the words felt inadequate, clumsy against the torrent of emotion building inside me. Caleb leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice thick. I needed you to know." But I didn't want him to retreat again, didn't want to feel the distance he kept trying to impose between us whenever he got too close. My hand turned over, palm pressing against his, and I tightened my grip before he could pull away. "You don't have to do this alone," I said, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "I've been feeling the same way, Caleb. I don't know what it means or what we're supposed to do, but I can't pretend either." He froze, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment the vulnerability there was so stark it made my chest ache. Then his hand tightened over mine, grounding me, steadying me even as my heart raced. "Say it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I need to hear you say it." I swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, but when I looked at him, everything else faded. The fear, the uncertainty, the thousand reasons why this was impossible. All I could see was him, waiting, hoping, needing something I couldn't deny. "I want you," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I've wanted you for so long." The words were barely out of my mouth before he leaned forward, his hand slipping to cup the back of my neck as his lips crashed into mine. This kiss wasn't like the first. It wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was raw, urgent, filled with all the longing we'd been trying to suppress. His fingers tangled in my hair, his breath warm against my skin, and I clung to him as if he were the only thing keeping me afloat. I didn't realize I was trembling until Caleb pulled back, his hands steadying me as his forehead pressed against mine. "You don't know how long I've waited to hear you say that," he murmured, his voice rough. "Then don't wait any more," I said, my voice steadier now, emboldened by the fire in his eyes. "I'm here, Caleb. I'm not going anywhere." He exhaled sharply, a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob, and then his lips were on mine again, softer this time, but no less intense. His hands slid down my arms, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, letting the world outside dissolve into nothingness. We didn't make it out of the kitchen. Somehow, we found ourselves pressed against the counter, his hands on my hips, mine tangled in his hair. The feel of him, solid and real beneath my fingers, was intoxicating. His lips moved against mine, firm but gentle, as if he were savoring every second. When his hands slid beneath my shirt, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of my back, I shivered, a soft gasp escaping my lips. He paused, his gaze searching mine for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. I nodded, a silent invitation, and he pulled me closer, his touch igniting something inside me I hadn't known was there. We stumbled our way to the couch, limbs tangled as we fell into the cushions. His weight pressed against me, grounding me, and I let myself get lost in him. The way his lips moved against mine, the way his hands mapped every inch of my skin as if he were trying to memorize me. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against my lips, his breath warm and ragged. "I don't want you to," I replied, my voice trembling but firm. That was all the encouragement he needed. His kisses trailed down my jaw, my neck, leaving a path of fire in their wake. My fingers gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer, and the rest of the world fell away. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of heat and light, every touch, every kiss stripping away the barriers we'd built between us. Caleb was everywhere. His hands, his lips, his whispered words of reassurance and longing. He was gentle but insistent, his every movement filled with a care that made my chest ache. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, his arms wrapped around me as my head rested against his chest. His fingers traced lazy patterns along my arm, his breathing steady and comforting. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, tilting my head to look up at him. "More than okay." He smiled then, that small, crooked smile that had always been my undoing, and I couldn't help but lean up to kiss him again, slow and lingering. "I don't know what happens now," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he said, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. "But we'll figure it out. Together." I nodded, letting his words settle over me like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. The days that followed were a careful dance, filled with stolen moments and unspoken promises. By day, we kept up appearances, but by night, when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, we let ourselves be honest. Each moment with Caleb felt like a revelation, a reminder of everything I hadn't known I was missing. His touch, his laughter, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It all felt like something out of a dream. But even dreams have their shadows. One night, as we sat together on the porch, the weight of the world pressed down on us once again. "Do you ever think about what happens if someone finds out?" I asked, my voice quiet. Caleb was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I try not to," he admitted. "But yeah, I do." "And?" I pressed, needing to hear his thoughts. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "I don't know. All I know is that I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, my voice firm. "No matter what happens, we'll figure it out." He nodded, his hand finding mine and squeezing it tightly. "We will." The weight of those words hung between us, both comforting and terrifying. I squeezed Caleb's hand in return, anchoring myself to the quiet certainty in his voice. Whatever was happening between us, however complicated or impossible it might seem, felt undeniable, like the current of a river too strong to fight. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of the trees in the night breeze. Caleb's thumb traced slow circles over the back of my hand, a soothing gesture that made my chest tighten. It felt as if we were suspended in time, the rest of the world far away, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that this could last. But the world always finds a way of intruding. The next morning, as sunlight spilled through the windows, the quiet intimacy of the night before felt like a distant memory. Caleb and I went about our work, careful not to let the tension between us show, yet every glance, every fleeting touch felt electric, a reminder of everything we were keeping hidden. It wasn't until the evening, after the day's work was done and the house had settled into its usual stillness, that the tension finally broke. Caleb found me in the living room, where I sat staring at an old family photo on the mantel. The picture was of us as kids, grinning wide and carefree back when life had seemed so simple. Seeing it now felt like a reminder of how far we'd come and how far we'd fallen from what anyone might consider normal. "You okay?" Caleb's voice was soft, but it startled me nonetheless. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression cautious. "Just thinking," I replied, setting the photo down, "about how much has changed." He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "Not all of it bad, I hope." "No," I said quickly, my voice catching. "Not bad." He hesitated for a moment, then crossed the room to stand beside me. His presence was grounding, his warmth radiating through the space between us. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low. I glanced up at him, my chest tightening at the way his eyes searched mine. "About us," I admitted. "About how this doesn't feel wrong, no matter how much it should." "It's not wrong," he said, his voice firm. "It's just complicated." I laughed softly, the sound bitter even to my own ears. "That's putting it mildly." Caleb reached out, his hand brushing against mine before curling around it. His touch steadied me, quieting the storm of doubts and fears that had been building inside me all day. "It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks," he said, his gaze unwavering. "What matters is what we feel, and I know what I feel." "Caleb, I love you," he said, the words quiet but resolute. "I don't care if it's messy or impossible. I love you." The breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't speak. His confession was everything I'd been afraid to say out loud, everything I'd been trying to suppress. But now that the words were out there was no taking them back. "I love you too," I whispered, the truth of it cutting through me like a blade. "I think I've loved you for a long time." Caleb smiled then, that small, crooked smile that always seemed to undo me. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, and for a moment we just stood there, the rest of the world fading away. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his breath warm against my skin. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out." And I believed him. In that moment, with his arms around me and his love anchoring me, I believed we could face whatever came next. The following weeks passed in a haze of quiet moments and stolen kisses, the world outside feeling more and more like an afterthought. We built something fragile but beautiful in the sanctuary of the old house, a life that felt separate from the rules and expectations of everyone else. But reality has a way of creeping in, no matter how hard you try to keep it out. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, Caleb broke the silence that had settled between us. "Do you think we'll ever stop hiding?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I hesitated, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know. Maybe we're not meant to." He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "I don't want to hide forever. I want to be with you. Really, be with you." His words hit me like a blow, the weight of them sinking into my chest. I wanted the same thing, more than anything, but the thought of what we might have to face to get there was terrifying. "I don't know if the world will ever understand us," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I know that I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Caleb said firmly, his hand reaching out to take mine. "No matter what happens, we'll figure it out. Together." I nodded, my fingers tightening around his. For all the uncertainty that lay ahead, for all the fear and doubt that still lingered, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't imagine a life without him. The night stretched on, the quiet of the house wrapping around us like a cocoon. We lay tangled together on the couch, the weight of the day slipping away as Caleb's arms held me close. His breath was warm against my neck, his hand tracing lazy patterns along my back. "I never thought I'd have this," he murmured, his voice soft and filled with wonder. "Have what?" I asked, my fingers brushing against his chest. "You," he said simply. "Us." His words made my chest ache, a bittersweet mix of joy and longing. I leaned up to kiss him, slow and lingering, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges we might face, I knew we'd face them together. And for now, that was enough.